This segment is about group fieldwork projects. Now, these have become somewhat more common recently as funding has gotten better. So it used to be the only way I could do fieldwork was as a solo individual field worker, and it's only since about 2005 that I've been able to get funding for projects that involved one or more junior project members in addition to myself. There's some that have been running for long periods of time. I know Terry Kaufman was always taking groups of people down to Mexico to work on Mayan languages or other languages there. That could be done, of course, rather cheaply compared to going to Africa, which is my area. There have been a lot of projects lately in Africa, many of them coming out of Europe, a few out of the U.S. or North America, and the obvious reason for doing group projects is that there are a hell of a lot of languages there, and very few of them are described. There are thousands of languages in Africa. Very few are well described, especially in West Africa, where you have, and maybe parts of like Sudan and in that area, where you also have a lot of languages that are undescribed. So kind of a Sahel belt, as Tom Goldman would say, where you have a tremendous amount of linguistic diversity and not many good linguists. And so it does make sense to have group projects. It's also good to invest in young linguists. It's something that I've tried to do not only in my actual projects, but just as a host, just as somebody who can help encourage somebody to come and do their own project, but with some logistical support, with possibly room and board in a provincial capital, and things like that will keep people going. I believe very strongly we need to get a lot of young linguists working in one way or the other, working on African linguistics and West African languages. Now, there are a lot of problems with group projects. It's hard enough to manage a group to do a research project on a campus with a bunch of people, or maybe a lab, or what have you. It's hard enough to manage a group of people, all of whom are, have their own personal issues. They get sick, they get a job, they get into or out of a relationship. Just a lot of life events that happen that are problematic. And if you're doing an experiment, sometimes the experiment doesn't work well. The results don't come out meaningful. So there are enough problems with running projects on campuses. Running a project involving Americans and Europeans and maybe Russians in West Africa has additional problems in addition to those. First of all, you have to live together to make it economical, so you need a house, and you need a staff, you need an assistant, you need a car, you need a driver, you need all these things. So it's really putting together a complex operation of a sort that has no parallel back home on campus. And people who are coming from different parts of the world who are new to that area, they have to get acclimatized in a lot of ways. They've got to get acclimatized to the heat. They'll probably get sick at some point. Hopefully it's not terribly serious, but it's it is a problem. Occasionally it is serious. We had one project member in my project who passed away in the field from after a brief illness that we don't really know much about. So there's a lot of things that can happen. We had to move from Mali to Burkina Faso rather quickly at one point because of a security breakdown in the country we were in. When an insurgency in the northern part of the country took over some cities in the north and was uncomfortably close to where we were working. We just packed up and got out of there and moved to the next country. So you have to expect a lot of bad things to happen. On the other hand, there's so many great things that happen in a project like ours. It's just wonderful to see somebody who first shows up in your project as someone right out of college, between college and grad school, and who ends up being very successful as a field worker, successful as a graduate student, and then successful as an academic. There's really that a few cases like that make up for all of the problems. And while I'm on that subject, I have learned from experience that is exactly the best time to get to bring new field workers to Africa. After graduation and before grad school. That way they've acquired, they've had a decent undergraduate education in linguistics. So they kind of know the ropes, the basic ropes theoretically. They can really sink their teeth into the language they're working on in a year of field work. Then they can go to graduate school and hit the ground running. They're in a very good position to get nice fellowships, to get accepted into good departments, and generally to have the momentum that will carry them forward into their careers. Now, of three American students that I've had either in my project or hosted by our project, but working on their own language, a different language, of three Americans who've come to West Africa with us between graduation and grad school. All three then got into grad schools, and two of them won very, very prestigious and lucrative National Science Foundation 3-year graduate fellowships. And so it's really nice to see that's the payoff you get from the effort of bringing young people in. Now, what can go wrong? Well, they can get sick. Occasionally, they don't make it back. Occasionally, they are brought back in a box. Usually, that's traffic accidents. The case that affected us was disease, but usually it's traffic accidents. If you talk to Peace Corps people, for example, almost all of the fatalities that they have in Africa are due to rollover accidents, things like that, or people running into power cables or being electrocuted, things like that. Accidents is mainly what happens. But other violence occasionally. I don't know of any field workers who've been murdered, any linguistic field workers who've been murdered, but theoretically could happen. You could be kidnapped, and if you're in West Africa, you could be kidnapped by bad guys, and if the ransom doesn't work out, they could be killed. But basically traffic accidents. Now, the nice thing about a group project is that you can cover the languages of a language family in a more or less uniform way. That is, you can leverage, if somebody has worked on one of the languages even to start with, you can develop a template for the grammar and a template for the lexicon that can be extended to the other languages. So you can leverage the work that you did on the first one. For example, if you learn the plants and animals, you can leverage that, and you don't have to learn all the plants and animals in the next language over, because you've done the work of identifying specimens or images or what have you, and you can in addition, you can make brief video clips that illustrate words. You can make photographs that illustrate objects. artifacts, for example, or topographic features, or termite mounds, or anything like that. And these short video clips, typically of verbs, of actions that are described by verbs, and still images that describe objects. You can reuse them for another language over, usually without much difficulty. So there's an efficiency you get. Finally, you get a uniformity of product. If the grammars of the different languages of the family are done to a similar format, so that you're taking advantage of the work that you've done before, that other people have done with closely related languages. So it really works out, it can work out really nicely in terms of the product of the project itself. But the best thing is launching the careers of the younger people. So remember, between graduation from college and grad school, that's the time for young field workers to do their first major field work. Okay, in this segment I want to talk about fieldwork methods. And I'm talking now about individual fieldwork, and I'll talk separately about group fieldwork projects. Now, in some ways I'm the worst person to advise anybody about fieldwork methods, since I learned how to do fieldwork by being basically thrown into the water and learning to swim that way. And I've been doing fieldwork for 40 years now, and on different continents. And I have my own way of doing things, which is not anybody else's way of doing things. Younger field workers are trained in to use specific software, to use specific techniques, and so forth and so on. And I don't use them. I probably would be a disaster if I tried to use them. I like to say that, to quote the captain in the novel The Caine Mutiny, who's the new Navy captain who takes over his ship and calls all the hands on deck and tells them there's 4 ways to do things. There's the right way, the wrong way, the Navy way, and my way. We'll do things my way. And that's sort of the way I do it. Now, my way is to short circuit or do shortcuts around the typical way of doing things, the right way, so to speak, which is to produce and process a large body of text, and then slowly, from that, slowly put together a lexicon and a grammar that comes from it. Now, in a sense, that's sort of the way I did my first major work on Nungabuyu, because I did start with a big textual corpus, and then I did use that as the basis for the dictionary and for the grammar. However, my way of doing things has evolved quite a bit since then. And what I do now is I start with a template. As I start with an idea for what the final product is going to be, and then that's the structure that I use, and then I just fill it in. So, and of course it helps to have done some work in the same part of the world where the words are going to be roughly translatable from one language to the next, where you know the plants and animals, you know the kind of food preparation techniques, you know something about the culture, and so you have an idea what people talk about. That way you can develop a basic lexical template that's customized for the part of the world that you work in. In my case recently, in the last 20 years, it would be West Africa. And then you just fill it in. That way you can do, for example, you can have French and English glosses that you go in with. You can have a semantic organization of the glosses already based on what you've done in the past, and you can and it's pretty easy in that context to just to obtain by elicitation a very good, solid, basic vocabulary, including the plants and animals, including a lot of other things. If you have an idea, kind of an inventory of lexical items that you need to collect, you can get that fairly rapidly. Now, for grammar, also, I like to start with the grammar template. I like to sit down nowadays with with an assistant or an informant and collect material, and it goes right into the grammar. So you start with the ones that are where that works best. You start with things like pronouns and demonstratives, and you move on to nouns and noun plurals and what have you, depending on what the language has. And then you do verbal inflection, and so a lot of word level things. And then later on, you can expand to more complex phrasal things. And of course, whatever you find in that particular language, you adjust to, and you tweak the template so it doesn't become a straitjacket. But using this system, I now can do a draft of a grammar of a reference grammar, and also a basic vocabulary. I can do a lot of it for a new language in a couple months. Now, of course, in the long run, elicitation in the end isn't. It's the way to get started. It's not the. It's usually not going to be the final product. So what you're going to do at some point, you do start collecting and transcribing the text. I think it really helps to have the basic lexicon and the basic grammar, especially morphology, before you do a lot of text transcription. But then you do that, and then you carefully annotate the text. You instead of recording many hours of text, it's much better to record 1 hour. But to transcribe it and translate it and annotate it minutely with lots of footnotes and so forth, and then when you're ready, when you've completed your text collection with whatever time you can allocate to that language, then you start pulling in examples from the text into the grammar, or just making references by page number or section number, whatever it might be, or some other code number from the grammar and the lexicon to particular textual passages for illustrations. Now, so the whole thing can be done I can do it in 3 months, and I've done it even with languages, as long as they're from the same geographical area and the same basic material culture. I've been able to do it in cases like a Mande language, using my knowledge of Dogon and Songhai languages, without having previously worked on a Mande language. So unless there's something that really is that really goes wrong in the fieldwork, that really causes a major problem in the fieldwork, in this way of doing things, it can be done rather quickly. Now, as I said, the younger people are trained in particular field methods with particular software and with a lot of rules about evidence and so forth. Frankly, if you have unlimited time and funding, you can afford to do things very slowly and deliberately and the correct way. I think it is a good idea for new field workers, for first-time field workers going to Africa or someplace, or New Guinea or the Amazon, and working on a language that they from a family that they have no background with. I think it probably is a good idea to do it the right way, and not my way. But once you've done it, been around the block a couple times, you've got to accelerate. You have to move faster, because in this day and age, people aren't going to pay you to go and spend very long periods of time working on individual languages, with rare exceptions. Now, this compares with the style of fieldwork that was explicitly favored by Leonard Bloomfield. And that was essentially a kind of osmosis where you go and you work for years, or at least for parts of each year over a long period of time with one language. You use perhaps participant observation in addition to more targeted elicitation, and you do it right. That's a wonderful ideal, but in this day and age, very few people other than missionary linguists who are sent to work on a language over decades and to do a Bible translation as well as lots of good works for the people over a long period of time, and are in no hurry and no time deadlines. But the rest of us, those of us who work in an academic setting, everything is about time management. And so I defend my system for doing things, even though it would be, if I were a new graduate student, I'm sure that my supervisor would not allow me to proceed in this fashion. All right, one thing about how to write the stuff up. I think you always want to do a reference grammar. I can't imagine any really good research on an undescribed language that doesn't include a reference grammar that brings everything together, shows how the pieces fit together. And it's something you can go back to and refer to as you're doing the text, just as the dictionary is something you can go back and refer to when you're doing the grammar or you're doing the text. So I believe strongly in a reference grammar. It doesn't have to be 1,000 pages long. It can be 400 pages long. That's usually enough to get a really good analysis of the language. There are some languages that do deserve longer treatment. For example, in my case, Tamashek was a language that I couldn't have done in a grammar, a 400-page grammar. Had to be much longer. A lot of morphology, a lot of lists of irregular plurals and things like that. And it just needed a larger grammar. It also needed a much larger dictionary than most of the languages I've worked on. Now, spin-offs. For each language, you got to find something that's really interesting about that language. And you don't know, unless you've worked on similar languages in the same language family, you don't know in advance what that's going to be. It might turn out to be the way the imperatives interact with the reflexives, which is one of the interesting things about Dogon. Another interesting thing about Dogon is the tonosyntax, particularly within noun phrases. How the words inside a noun phrase, how they interact with each other tonally. A lot of the languages in West Africa, it's something related to the tonal system or the intonational system or something that is the most interesting piece of it. In the case of Songhai languages, probably the most important thing is the bidirectional case marking. This is a marker that you stick in between the subject and the object when they are otherwise adjacent, when they would otherwise be adjacent. And that happens only in the perfective positive, where you have the zero perfective marking and the zero positive marking. Otherwise, in the other cases, there's an inflectional marker, a non-zero inflectional marker that comes in between them. And so you have but when there is that zero, when they would be adjacent, and that can only happen in the SOV part of Songhai languages by definition. You get a syllabic morpheme. It's not an epenthetic glide or something. It's a real morpheme, and it's a bidirectional case marker. And that was the interesting thing. That thing disappears when either the subject or the object disappears for some syntactic reason or other. So that's a spin-off paper. So you find things like that are interesting about the language. They're going to be interesting to other people who don't care much about that language family as such, and you do that. And that keeps everybody happy. You have the reference grammar, the one-stop source for all the information that people might need, all the basic information about the language. You have a lexicon in some form, electronic or published, doesn't matter, and that's something that people can look at for historical, linguistic purposes or whatever. You have texts which, among other things, illustrate the grammatical phenomena, and you have the spin-off papers, and basically at that point you're done.